Good evening. Thank you all for being here. I'm Jessica Morgan. I'm the director of Dia Art Foundation. Welcome. Warhol, of course, is known for his expansive approach to media. He was an illustrator, he was a window designer, he was a filmmaker, he was a television producer, he was a magazine editor, an artist, a media star. Yet despite this, we constantly present him as an autonomous artist, a singular creative genius, something that, of course, is reinforced by a presentation like this, our exhibition here, The Shadows. But in fact, his practice consistently undermined this view, exploring a collaborative, expanded notion of creativity. Though Warhol, of course, played famously with contradictions, at the heart of his work is a radical move away from the idea of individual authorship and the role of the autonomous artist. Even in the studio, there was the notion of his assistants producing his work. He moved away from this idea of the subjective genius. Warhol presented himself as a creative director rather than as an auteur, a role now widely implemented in our culture industry, and especially in fashion. Warhol famously pronounced that he wanted to be like a machine, denying again this notion of subjective expression. In 1963, he said to Gene Swenson in an interview that everybody looks alike and acts alike, and we're getting more and more that way. I think everybody should be a machine. I thought that tonight we could talk about this idea of Warhol as a pioneer of an open understanding of what it can be to be an artist, not as the solitary genius, but rather the collaborator, someone who brilliantly reflects and problematizes their context and moment in time. I'm very happy to be joined by three people who need very little introduction, and whose work has overlapped as friends, as collaborators, Sandra Brant, Raf Simons, and George Condo. While Sandy worked on the film L'Amour with Warhol in the early 1970s and was a close friend over many years, she was also the publisher of Interview magazine in the years after Warhol's death. Raf has famously used Warhol's imagery in his design work, including Warhol's portrait of Sandra Brant. And of course, very graciously supported the presentation of The Shadows here, and I want to make a big thank you to everybody at Calvin Klein, because it's been a great pleasure presenting this work from our collection in this space here for the last few weeks and for 2 more weeks to come. George Condo was briefly in Warhol's printmaking studio when he first moved to New York in 1980, and later befriended the artist in Manhattan, saying that they were the only two people who still lived uptown. And in fact, this is quite a Dia family affair. Both Sandy and George are beloved Dia trustees. And thank you, all three of you, for joining me tonight. I know public speaking is not your favorite thing, so we appreciate it very much. Thank you all for joining us tonight. So Sandy, Interview magazine was founded by Warhol in 1969, and you joined initially as an advertising director. And as I mentioned, only after his death became the publisher of the magazine, but you remained very close to Warhol over many years. Sandy, I wonder if you can speak to Warhol's involvement with the magazine and what you thought he was trying to achieve with it. What was the position of the editorial group? How was Interview understood? Was it a lifestyle magazine? Was it a fashion forum? Was Warhol outspoken about Interview's direction? And how do you see this in relation to the conceptual work that he was producing simultaneously?
Well, I think that...
Yeah, just hold it up close.
Oh, hello. I think the way to think about Interview as a really brilliant conceptual work. Andy used to say that he was able to create the magazine with just 2 machines, a camera and a tape recorder. And I think what was genius about it is it was really this simple idea of people talking. It's been said that, in a way, Andy created reality television. He invented the form with his films and with the Q&As that were in Interview. Like the paintings, they were a dead-on look at the subject. There was very little editing done, and the intention was to make the reader feel like they were a fly on the wall. Andy put on the tape recorder and he put it to work so that the reader feels that they too are sitting, because often he did interviews at places like Quo Vadis. He loved to do it at a restaurant. And so the reader feels as though they're seated at the table along with everybody else. And it's made more that way because everything was put into the interview. When the waiter came over and said the specials were in the interview. When people ordered what they ordered, everything was there. There was really almost no editing. So reading these interviews is like eavesdropping on a conversation. Joel Schumacher, the director, used to tell the story that years ago, Lillian Gish was recalling the early days, when she and her sister and D.W. Griffith were first beginning to make movies. And it applies to interview. She said that you have to remember that when we first started to make movies, it was before anybody knew there was going to be such a thing as the movies. And in a way, likewise, when Andy started Interview, it was before the rest of the world knew that there was going to be the culture of celebrity, which is now so omnipresent. And you talked about collaboration. His interviews, Andy's interviews, were always, or often, done in a kind of tag team form. So they were more like, the interviews were more like happenings, as entertaining to the subject as to the reader. He had an ability to draw people out. He was interested in a zillion different subjects, and he had a kind of uncanny skill to blur the lines between the interviewer and the interviewee, and therefore the insider and the outsider.
Beautifully put, Sandy. I wanted you to talk a bit about the covers of Interview. Who chose the stars? How did the covers come about? And what was the connection, if any, to the more commercial aspect of Warhol's work, the portraits, the commissioned portraits that were supporting the studio practice, the factory, during the 1970s especially?
Well, I think the interesting thing is to think about magazine publishing today and how there's so many rules concerning covers, and it's a very formulaic way of thinking. You know, what do you do to sell as many issues as possible? What color is the logo? Never make a green cover. Lots of cover lines. So it's sort of interesting and an adventure to look back at the first decade of Interview and to think about how those covers were done. I think they kind of made it up as they went along, because the covers started as publicity shots, or sometimes old film stills. It was a very pragmatic tactic. Obviously, you didn't have to pay for those things. And then the covers became like painterly objects. And again, it was a collaboration between the subject, the photographer who was taking the picture, and then along came Richard Bernstein, who started out as the art director, but then it turned out that Richard would really paint all the covers, something you would never be able to do to a Mario Testino photograph anymore. But those embellished images were almost like a pop version of kabuki makeup. And that painterliness really added to the glamour of the covers. You know, the intention, again, of a cover is to be a magnet on the newsstand. You're supposed to want to buy that magazine or subscribe to the magazine. And Andy's covers were driven much more by a sensibility of experimentation and an art sensibility, rather than, as much as he liked money, rather than the jingle of the cash register. And the subjects also, I mean, this was really different at that time. Now everybody has a publicist and a manager, and every magazine has a wrangler. But with interview, they often went directly to the subjects, to the stars, and sometimes scooping all the big magazines. Andy would see people socially, he'd go to dinner, he would go to a premiere, and then he would walk into the office the next day and say, we can do an interview with Raquel tomorrow. And people wanted to be in the magazine because they were treated fairly. What ended up in the magazine was exactly what they said. There was no editing, so it was, there was not an editor that came along and looked at the copy and said, oh, you can't say that, or, that didn't happen. And that was very liberating for the subject and liberating for the audience.
Sandy, you were involved too in another aspect of this expanded practice, which I'm wanting to draw out here, of Warhol's work in film production as well. You were the producer of the film L'Amour from the early 1970s. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that process and sort of how that came about, but also did those worlds collide? Were these the same people working in the film world, to the interview world, to the studio? What was your experience there?
Well, I think film really inspired the beginnings of the magazine. Andy and his collaborators were no strangers to the film world. At that point, they'd been, the process of making movies was already going on when Interview began. And if you think about it, film, in a way, gave birth to some of his greatest paintings. If you think of the Marilyn, Liz, Elvis, and I also think it's interesting to look at the Warhol factory and the superstars, because I think when all that was going on, it was Andy's idea that he was creating a kind of radical art equivalent of the old Hollywood system. L'Amour was a movie that we made in Paris. We made it with Jane Forth, who was around. She was one of the superstars, Donna Jordan, Patty D'Arbanville. And the idea for the movie was that these hippie girls would go to Paris and meet millionaires, and they would marry millionaires. So it was this crazy story that was just made up as they went along. That Michael Sklar was the heir to a deodorant fortune, and he wanted to marry Donna because that way, if he married Donna, he could adopt his boyfriend, who was a gigolo. And the person in the movie who was giving love advice to everybody was Karl Lagerfeld, because he played the sort of the wealthy German industrialist giving love advice to everybody. And I think we ended up in Paris because when I first met Andy and Fred and Jed and everybody at Max's Kansas City, I had been really interested in there was one little tiny book about an exhibition on Art Deco at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. So I was talking about Art Deco and going to Paris and finding it, and it turned out Fred had exactly the same book. So on that first meeting, we proposed we'd all go to Paris, and at this point, it wasn't worth anything, and nobody knew where to find it, and there really weren't any. Karl was collecting, Yves Saint Laurent was collecting, Ileana Sonnabend, and that was about it. And everybody would be running around Paris avoiding the other person. I remember once going to a dealer called Le Ciotre, and I was there with Fred and Andy, and Mr. Le Ciotre said, "Oh, Henry Geldzahler's here, quick, hide in the closet." And we were in the closet while Henry was out there looking at something else. I don't know why we had to hide in the closet. But so Paris was a place that, that was the time when Merce Alexander Yolis was presenting Merce Cunningham, and that was Andy's pillows and Jasper's costumes. So, and we'd go to La Capole every night, and there were this young American couple called Patty and Mark, and they would sell interview to people eating dinner at the tables. So I think we ended up in Paris because it was fun.
That sounds like the film I want to see. The parallel film that wasn't recorded. Raf, historically designers have been positioned as subjective auteurs, especially when we think about haute couture, but simultaneously as creative directors that are tasked with building and maintaining brands. In this respect, you could say much like Warhol, they're good at following the political economy of the culture industry. I was wondering, if you feel that you could recognize Warhol as reflecting in his work or way of working the way in which fashion is produced, at once occupying this position of auteur and at the same time becoming a creative director.
I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated with him in the first place. I think I never really saw him as an artist only, although he's obviously defined as an artist. But what struck me always since the beginning, because I think that originally when I saw the work, it was the Velvet Underground record cover, and that's what brings you then to the work. Many years after, obviously I wasn't born when all this was happening. I think that when I was young, I was into music very much. So I think that bands like Joy Division and the Velvet Underground, I was very attracted to these kind of bands, being a young new wave kid, and then you go back in time because of the people you meet. That's how I also kind of got in touch with the artwork, and then you start to investigate more and more and more. But what struck me always is that there seemed to be no choice from him. There was no choice from him for a certain medium. There was no choice from him for a certain style or reference. It could go in so much different directions, and I think because it was him and because of everything that you knew, that I knew, and that lots of us knew about him and everything that surrounded him, it became so mysterious and strong and incredibly to follow. Like, it was something I really wanted to kind of follow more and more and more and more once I found out about it. It's difficult to explain, I think, because he touched things that I would never expect myself to find interesting. But then, because of the mediums, and also because of techniques and because of obviously the definition of style, it became very convincing. So whether if it was a newspaper article or a photograph that is part of a newspaper that you would normally just not even see, or you would just kind of flip to a newspaper, but because he had the ability to choose a picture or make a picture, because he made a lot of the pictures that were afterwards the base for the paintings, and the way his methods were to kind of make that his artwork, I think that was ultimately striking to me from the beginning till the end. And obviously you have examples that I favor, especially I think it's generally noted I'm a big fan of the Dead and Disaster works. I think they have an incredible big influence on contemporary artists also, but not only. I have to say the shadows, I'd never seen them in real, and they are striking. They are striking because of because of the similarity of a lot of photographs that you know from him. Because of the Polaroid technique, I see the same thing all the time. There was always the black shadow in a way. But as Mathieu, my right hand, mentioned today, the striking part is that a shadow is always black. But here, there was a lot of color. And that's one of those examples where he's able to was able to flip something so common and so recognizable and so in your face in a way into something that became his style, his identity, and obviously it's much broader because it's not only the works, it's also the movies, it's the entourage, it's the factory, it's all the people that were linked to him. Whether it was very, very, and I think you know very well because you knew him so well, very, very obviously decided by him and curated by him, or whether if it was just natural and maybe sometimes rather coincidental. The choices of the people that he surrounded himself with, or the people that just walked in there, I don't know, I wasn't there, but you know, it's so together as a universe, and I think there was very little people who are able to do that. So yes, it's kind of like a creative directorship one way or another.
So that leads into what I wanted to ask you next, actually, which is about this idea of collective process, we could say, which is very much part of the production of fashion. And you obviously work with your team, but you've also worked with Sterling Ruby, you've worked with George. Have you thought about how you or the world of fashion operates in relation to Warhol's enterprise? I mean, do you see parallels when you work with your creative team? Do you see any kind of Warholian model for that?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I never really thought about it in that way, but all I can say is that I think that it was definitely an inspiring. He was an inspiring example to not stay stuck in one mindset when you're a creative animal. For me. Because obviously for somebody else it can be completely the opposite. But I never really felt, and maybe he was one of the examples that I thought were extremely inspiring in that sense. It has never really been attractive to me to do only one thing. So in that sense, I do like collaboration as much as doing things on my own. I actually think maybe I like it even more. I am in need for dialogue. Constantly, and I don't, as I said before, I don't know how it was for Andy. Maybe Sandy, you can talk about it. But like clearly, he was in need for people around him all the time, whether they helped him technically with diamond dust or peeing on the paintings. You know, some of the guys. And making the movies or editing the magazine, or I mean, like he clearly was not a loner. He was not somebody alone in a studio. In that sense, I relate. I could also not really be alone in a studio, I think.
So, Raf, thinking of this kind of singular role that's given to Warhol in the culture industry today. Would you advocate for fashion to be recognized as a way of producing new forms of cultural articulation in the manner in which he did? And if so, how could this be made more visible? I mean, do contemporary progressive creative designers need to position themselves differently from the old model of couturier and the catwalk? I mean, thinking of this idea of the expanded context and expanded collaboration.
Well, it's a choice for everybody, I think. Personally, I always thought it was interesting once you get a voice to use your voice. But lately, it's also dangerous, I think. So I don't know where it's going to evolve. You know, I'm from Belgium, and in Belgium we had huge political issues 1.5 decades ago, and I had a voice. You know, I do know I had a voice towards Belgian youth, so we also did collections that related to what was happening in the country in order to kind of make clear to that young generation that maybe by talking about it or confronting, you can maybe do something about it. That's always something that I have liked. And it's not something that the audience always likes. But right now in fashion, because obviously in art it's of ultimate importance, I think, in fashion I see there is a fear. There is a fear for people that want to confront what's made in fashion with what's going on in the world. It's sometimes not welcomed. I think fashion sometimes tends to answer with a flower dress because it's so beautiful and sensitive, because there is trouble in the world. I don't think it's always it's not the only way. I think it's also a tool that has a reach, and it can open a dialogue. I recall a collection I recently did about drug addiction in my own brand, and unfortunately it was not for everybody. But then people don't always analyze in fashion. I think we miss a dialogue there. Maybe the speed has changed the medium. I think critical dialogue is absolutely a must in the world and in all. We're talking creative environment, creative media, and I think that in fashion lately it's becoming more and more not present. And I hope that it can change. I hope that can change again, because I think that is the only way to kind of build a culture and build an interesting future for the medium.
George, I was reading recently that Warhol's studio, the factory, even influenced Joseph Beuys's work at the Düsseldorf Academy. The idea of a collective space of production influenced his teaching, Beuys's teaching, and ultimately the idea of dismantling the Meisterschule, the master-pupil structure that existed previously at the Academy in Düsseldorf. Now that was, of course, Beuys's interpretation of the factory, but I wondered, when you worked for Warhol, albeit briefly, was there any aspect of teaching going on? Was there an education to be had there?
Well, I got a lot of education out of being there. I was like 23 years old, and I got this job there. But I was thinking about it. Like, I had this painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat that I owned. It was called Low Boy and Junkie Paradise. And on it was written, Lux lucet in tenebris, okay, which is a Latin phrase that means light shines in the shadows. And my feeling is that Warhol, he was obsessed with Leonardo da Vinci. And these pieces, the shadows, the light shining in these pieces is so extraordinary that, from the Mona Lisas, the show that was at the Whitney that Donna did, the Mona Lisas being the early works, leading to the Last Suppers and the camouflage Last Suppers, it's almost like what I learned was that Andy wanted to be the greatest artist that ever lived. That's what he wanted to be. All the other stuff was secondary. Anyone can talk about Andy Warhol. Like, I can tell you stories about, hanging out with Andy and taking a cab uptown with Andy Warhol. But what he really wanted to do was to compete with Leonardo da Vinci. He wanted to do, his Mona Lisa was, Marilyn. And he knew that his real competitor in the art world, the only guy that he could possibly compete with, seems to me have been someone like Leonardo, whose painting obviously went for the most money in history, and Andy would have loved that. And all of these paintings around the room, you can look at them and think, yeah, there's this really sort of, hard Franz Klein-like feel to them, this real brushstroke, but the light that shines in the shadow just keeps striking me as being more and more inspiring, that there's more light in the shadow than there is in the light, before you even get to the shadow. And so, like, the educational process, of having been there as a kid and never really met Andy at that time. Just worked at the factory and, put diamond dust down on the backgrounds, and kept thinking, like, I know, Andy's there somewhere. And the phone would ring, and suddenly he would want the colors changed without ever having seen the paintings. And we'd bring the work to him to 18th Street, and, he would have a look and act really embarrassed about his work. Like, these are really strange, I haven't seen these before, but I was there, and like the phone was ringing every minute, and he was changing the colors left and right and saying, go grab this color, go grab that color, go do this, go do that, go do this, go do that. And so the educational aspect of it was to realize that he was, regardless of whoever did his work, he felt they were his paintings. And it was all about his work. And it was being created by people, but it was all him. And that really shows in his paintings. Also, in my opinion, thinking about Leonardo, the Mona Lisas, the Last Suppers, the shadows, the obsession with timelessness, that he had this obsession with timelessness. And I think that's why he recorded every second of his life in his journals, and every penny that he ever spent, and every sort of thought to a certain degree. And like the Empire State Building is a sort of amazing, just timeless study of the Empire State Building, and his work has this incredible timeless feeling to it, but it captures the moment. The disaster series, like Ralph was talking about, these capture this incredible moment when somebody lands on a car hood, and you see it over and over and over again, or a car crash, or the race riots, and you can't forget them. They just burn this thing into your mind like you're never going to forget this moment.
Maybe you can talk a bit about the seriality, George. I mean, the shadows is... amongst only half of the shadows, there's 102 in total, so that that we're talking serious seriality here. I mean, you've obviously in your own work used motifs, there are themes, there are repeat characters, there are stylistic tropes that you use, but this sort of back to Warhol's idea of being a machine. I mean, the sort of idea of the seriality in Warhol, of course, is a completely different undertaking. But how do you approach that in his work?
I feel like he said things to make people believe something, but in the reality, he did something completely different than what he told people he was doing. That his whole thing was about saying, I'm deeply superficial. Or, someone like Gore Vidal said, he's the only genius I ever met with an IQ of 40. I mean, the things that have been said about Andy Warhol are amazing. But having, hung around with him and just talked about, I don't know, Rembrandt or Franz Hals or, painters, I have a feeling that he just kept doing things. Let's just take something like the Goldberg variations. You've got a motif, and then you've got a development of all those motifs until it's fully played out. And the piece begins and ends with the same exact piece. And it's really amazing because it begins with a hello and goes through a super, I don't know how many variations, maybe 32 or something. I don't know how many variations there are, and ends on the exact same piece that it begins with, but it feels like it's a goodbye. And I think Andy's seriality had something to do with of course, there's that expression, repetition is a form of change. I don't know if that was like Lamont Young or Philip Glass or one of them. But I think that Andy was sort of a continuum. He thought about this idea of the continuum in his work, and that it kept going and going and going until it reached its finality. And when it did, it did. There was no further piece he could have done. So all of the Seriality are, in fact, variations on a single theme. So you can see them all in like multiple portraits of, Ethel Skull or Jackie or whatever, and they change each time. They're sort of variations on a theme. They're like, in my opinion, there's some jazz aspect to it, like a performer who goes out there and, like someone like John Coltrane, who plays my favorite things like 40 nights a year, and every single time he plays it, the tune, the theme, but he's going to take it out and do this variation, and he's going to like take it out and, and sort of, I don't know, find his way to escape through every image.
It's very well put, George. And I always think with this work, especially, you see the difference in yes, seriality, but every single panel is completely different. George, in some sense, you're the opposite of what I've been describing tonight of Warhol. You're a studio artist who paints on your own in your studio.
Yeah, I do. Totally different.
You have, of course, ventured into multiple collaborations, most recently, even the night before last, and last night, producing on stage an entirely new understanding of producing a backdrop. You were performing live, painting, and you've, of course, worked on your own music. You've collaborated with magazines. You've had a lot of work in collaboration with other artists as well. Do you see that part of your work in the vein of Warhol as well, or do you see that as a very separate part of your artistic practice?
Well, my situation, like my work is very sort of individual in the sense, like I was working at Keith Haring's studio once when I didn't have a studio in New York, and I came back from Paris, and Keith said, you can work on one of these big tarps. And he said, Andy wants to come over and he wants to photograph you painting. I said, great. But it's a little embarrassing because, like in the middle of this painting. And he said, no, he would love that. So I said, all right, whatever. So Andy comes over, and I'm painting, and I'm just like painting something. And so Andy says to me, so you mean you just paint anything you want? I could never do that, he said. And he said, you just go up there and you paint anything you want? And I said, yeah, that's what I do. I thought that's what artists do. He said, no, I could never do anything like that. And I couldn't figure out if he was talking like Fred Hughes would kill him if he did, or Bruno Bischofberger would like wring his neck for like not painting like another, reversal of Mao or something crazy like that, or if he was simply saying he could not go up to the canvas and just paint anything that came to his mind. But that's what I do. So like last night, the performances that we had last night and the night before where we did the opera, and Raph did these amazing costumes that were just outrageous. And I said, I just want to start from a blank canvas. I don't want to know what I'm going to do. I really never do. I don't want to know what I'm going to paint. I don't want to program. I don't want to what I call paint per view or whatever it's called, paint on demand. I just like the idea of going there and not knowing what I'm going to do.
Paint by numbers.
Yeah. Well, I love that Andy did the paint by number paintings, and those were amazing. I asked him. He said to me he wanted to do my portrait, and I said, would you do a paint-by-number version? He said, I haven't done one of those in a long time. And then, unfortunately, he passed away, that was a drag, I got to say. It was a big drag. When Andy died, it was such a drag, I can't tell you. He wasn't, we thought he was like 100 years old, but he was actually younger than I am today. And, not that I'm that young, but he was. He was like, but when I was like younger, me and Jean-Michel and Keith and all that, we thought he was like this old, like, master, like so much older than all of us. But in the end of the day, like, when I think about it, he was younger than I am. It's weird. And he did so much. I mean, any artist that could accomplish what Andy Warhol accomplished, that's something, I tell you.
George, did you ever go back to the studio? Not where you worked, but
to his?
Yeah.
Well, my job was pretty, rough. Like, like, I got the job because I wrote something about Andy Warhol. I was working at an employment agency, and somebody said, like, you know, the master printer Rupert Smith was an artist, and this one of the deals was like, you know, hey, you got a job sorting out slides for 2 weeks in a gallery. So I went there, and it was Rupert Smith's work. It wasn't even Andy's. And then Rupert had convinced, and also Rupert introduced Andy to the idea of diamond dust. Apparently he had found it in Florida as something that they use on the like sidewalks, and Andy thought it was really sparkly and glamorous. So they said, can somebody write a press release about this show? So I wrote this press release, and it had to be checked by Warhol. And so he read it, and he said, oh, whoever wrote this, I want him to come to the factory and just write about anything that goes on. So would you like to get a job doing that? And I said, yeah. Crazy? Definitely. I go over there, and they give me a typewriter, and I remember sitting down in this place on Duane Street where they were working on the Myth. They had just finished the 12 Famous Shoes, and then they were going on to the Myth series. And I went in, and I started typing, like, today they had foie gras, and then Rupert ordered caviar, and then, you know, Horst, the master printer, was really mad because, like, you know, he didn't like that Andy called up and said, don't do a rainbow roll, you know, because a rainbow roll is a really cool thing when you're doing printing, okay? That's when you lay out all these colors on the screen and you pull a squeegee and get this, like, kind of multicolored thing that goes across. And so I was typing all this stuff, and then they asked me if I knew how to silk screen, and I said, I can most likely do it because I worked in a silk screen t-shirt place in Boston. And so they brought me a portrait of Diana Ross that needed to be restored, and there was a little white dot in her afro. And so Rupert brought this little cup of black paint over, and he said, do you think you can fix this? So I said, yeah. So I leaned over, and I put this little tiny dot like that. And they were like, oh my God, you're such a great painter. You're amazing. And I was like, these guys are so funny. They're like, just like what I read about, you know? And then from then on, I got the job, like working on this production after putting a little dot on Diana Ross's hair. And like, it was pretty cool working there. Yeah. But it was hard work because we got there at 10 in the morning and we didn't leave till 12 at night. And Andy never came because the fumes were so extremely strong. I mean, the chemicals that you use to clean the screens and the cleaning of screens and changing the screens and the amount of, there wasn't as much air conditioning and, you know, it wasn't quite what you would think, you know, working in a factory. It was actually really more like what you would think working in a factory is than what it really has been sort of photographed and documented as. But the funny thing is, I was thinking about it the other day, every night at about 11, what we would do would take all the test prints by Andy and crunch them up and put them in a big garbage bag. And then me and this kid, Michael, we had to carry them all down the stairs, like 5 flights down the stairs, and fill a dumpster that was as big from here to you with Andy Warhols every single night. So we probably dumped like billions and billions of dollars of Andy Warhols every night in the dumpster, and like they would just cart it out. Can you imagine? And like, I mean, we had to because they were just like test prints, but they were often amazing, you know, like full-on.
You have a place like that behind you?
Sorry?
You have this dumpster behind your house?
No, I wish I did, you know. So that's all I can say about, but educationally it was, you know, the nicest thing was that Rupert gave me like a big stack of paper because I really couldn't afford art materials at that time, so he gave me a big stack of paper. I did a lot of drawings on those sheets of paper, and I mean, it was great because I didn't really know Andy when I worked for him, and I went twice to 18th Street to deliver something and just stood there in sort of a a blazer and khaki pants and stood in the corner and remember he had that big Dalmatian or whatever it was, that big Great Dane stuffed, and he would look at everything, and then that's what I was afraid about when I was at Keith's. I was like, he's going to recognize me from when I worked there, because he met me twice and he didn't, and I never got to tell him I worked for him. I wanted to, but I thought, you know what, he probably maybe he would have thought I was a lousy artist if I told him I worked for him. That's the kind of guy he was,
Well, thank you all. I just wanted to close and seeing as we're in this very special environment to be having a talk in, and ask Sandy and Raph and George about, George, you've spoken quite a lot about your thoughts about the shadows, but Raph especially, because you've been living with these as your neighbor for the last few weeks, sort of how your perception of them has changed over this time.
Yeah, I'm struck, I have to say. I only knew them from seeing them in books. I'd never seen them in real. And I think you did an amazing job, the way you present them, by the way. And I'm obsessed with colors in general. That's one of my things. So I'm actually really struck with the coloration and the juxtaposition from one to the other. If I understood well, there is a freedom to hang them, which I think is also interesting. So he didn't make a rule. And obviously the painterly quality is quite different from most of the Warhol work that I know, which I think is also very interesting, specifically within one body of work, that there is so much diversity in the actual quality of the painting. So I mean, the work that I know very well is figurative. Now we are talking a shadow. At the end, it's photographed from a shadow. So is it figurative? Is it abstract? But the way it works together. And as a matter of fact, I recently saw one isolated also, which was also quite impressive, I have to say. But here, I think the juxtaposition is quite mind-blowing. So I'm very happy that we live with them for a while.
Sandy, any thoughts?
I've never seen them done as almost a square. And I think they look incredible like this. At Dia, it's a much longer room. And I mean, you always think of Andy as being the greatest colorist after Matisse. And you really see that in these paintings.
Thank you, all three of you. Fantastic.